Well, good evening. Being asked to write an endorsement for a book, something that will appear forevermore on the back cover, is a very troubling thing. I've been asked to write a few over the years, and I always wonder myself, but what if I don't like it? With this book, I didn't have to wonder. I knew I wouldn't like it, even before I opened the front cover. So in my little paragraph of endorsement, I described coming home as both accessible and dangerous. So let me say now just a little more about those two words. Jonathan Cornford writes well, deceptively well. Whatever Jonathan writes, here or elsewhere, his prose is consistently clear and concise. He communicates in ways that make the business of writing and the subjects that he writes about entirely accessible. On the surface, this appears to be straightforward. I know it's not. As someone who aspires to write well, it's clear to me that Jonathan has been honing his craft for a long time. What is lovely about this is that though Jonathan is committed to communicating clearly with us, he is not, I think, motivated by the art of writing. Instead, Jonathan is driven by a commitment to the things he writes about. Ideas, arguments, convictions, those that he holds deeply and is vocationally called to share with others. For all of those reasons, this book is a substantial but an easy read. But don't be fooled. It's also dangerous. As in his previous book, Coming Back to Earth, what Jonathan is calling us to here is an expression of the Christian faith that really counts, one that has legs in the daily actions of our lives. For this reason, coming home bites. Jonathan calls me again to look at the way I live in my home. He pokes around in my daily practices of work and leisure. He asks me to consider my patterns of consumption. He gets involved in my shopping as well as in my relationship to the earth. In the last 3 chapters, he even peers into my wallet. He interrogates my relationship with money, my commitments to generosity, my practices of saving and investing, even my approach to debt. It's all a bit awkward, really. So no, I don't like this book much, but I need it. And I reckon we all need it. What made it possible for me to stay with this book all the way to the end is that Coming Home is not a preachy book. I don't like those. True, in every chapter and on every issue, it asks the question, what does the Bible say? It's a book that takes the Bible seriously, as it does the obligations of discipleship. Still, though deeply grounded in faith, this book never shames or berates. I know well enough that my efforts to follow Jesus are pretty ordinary even on my good days. And frankly, I don't need reminders of my failings. I need encouragement to keep at it. I find in this book the encouragement that I need. I don't like it, but I'm encouraged by it. My vision of what is possible within the ordinariness of my life is lifted just a notch. Coming home is like a wise friend who buys me a coffee, fair trade of course, and then prods me with just the right questions. I have to confess, at the risk of making Jonathan uncomfortable, what I find most compelling about this book is Jonathan himself. Over the last decade or so, I've had the privilege of sitting on a small advisory group for Manna Gum, the organisation that Jonathan and Kim founded some years ago. The purpose of Manna Gum is twofold: to help Christians like me reclaim and practice biblical teaching on material life. And secondly, to promote understandings of the ways that our economic lives impact upon ourselves, others, and the earth. What I have seen at relatively close quarters is that the Cornford family lives this stuff. They don't just talk about it. A few years back now, we lost our dear friend Ross Langmead. I still miss him, as I know that many of you do too. For so many years, Ross and Alison quietly embodied the call of Jesus in their daily lives. They never grandstanded. They never blew trumpets, certainly not their own. They just got on with it. And in their getting on with it, we were all challenged to be better people. I feel like Jonathan and Kim are made of the same stuff. The gift that they bring to us is of a similar kind. Faith is real to them. The struggles, the questions, the daily practices of living well in the world, and in numerous ways, they've been quietly encouraging others to do the same. I, for one, am very grateful for them, and I am very grateful for this book. So for this reason alone, Coming Home is a book that deserves to be read. The fact that it's been shortlisted for the 2019 Australian Christian Book of the Year Award is a wonderful endorsement of that fact. So, I commend this book to you, and I declare it launched.
Wow, thank you, Simon. It's hard to quite know what to say after that, except to say Simon's book, Heaven All Around Us, has also been nominated for, Australian Christian Book of the Year Award, and personally it's the one I hope gets up tomorrow night, is the night actually. So thank you very much for those words, Simon, but more importantly, thank you for the support that you've given in writing this book, actually. I came to Simon right in the early days of writing the first chapter of this book and showed it to Simon, and he said, I really like this stuff, but... and he gave me a few tips on how I'm pitching it, and that sent me away, and I thought about it for a couple of years after that before I really got around to it. But that was invaluable help to me, so thank you. A big thanks to Whitley College too for putting this on tonight, and Anne especially for your work, and Steve Lyle and others. It's very, very grateful for providing this space for us tonight. So tonight I'm not really going to talk directly about what's in the book. I rather want to take the opportunity just to elaborate a bit more about some of the underlying ideas behind the book, actually. I'm hoping you might get the book to find out what's in it. So writing in the 1920s, with the horrors of the First World War behind him, and the hedonistic spectacle of the roaring 20s unfolding before him, the economic historian, political activist, and committed Christian R.H. Tawney concluded his now classic work, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, with the following words. Capitalism is now in the hour of its triumph, and yet it sometimes leaves a taste of ashes on the lips of civilization. Although Tawney grasped the dynamism of capitalism better than most, Tawney could not have then envisaged how deep and how complete the triumph of capitalism would become in the following century. Since then, it has restructured finance, production, labour and consumption in virtually every nation. It has sent down its roots into most social spaces, including the family, community groups, and even the church. And it has penetrated into almost every ecological niche on the planet, from pole to the deepest recesses of the oceans, and colonising even the inner reaches of space. And perhaps Tawney could not have either have envisaged just how palpable the taste of ashes would become. As the 21st century unfolds, the scale of challenges facing humanity seems daunting, to say the least. I'm sure you know by now that we're living in the midst of a multi-dimensional planetary ecological crisis, of which climate change, although it's the most scary, is not even the most urgent dimension. I'm not going to tonight trot out a bunch of statistics on species extinction or soil loss or plastic pollution, but I'm sure you have some idea of what I'm talking about. At the same time, the human community is now more economically unequal than it has ever been before in its history. This year's Oxfam Inequality Report informs us that the top 26 richest people on the planet now own as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. That is 26 people controlling the same amount of wealth as no, that figure's wrong. It's not 4.3 billion. And not yet. It's something like 3.7 billion. I'm not sure how that number got in there. But the gap between the top 20%, which is us, and the bottom 20% is also becoming increasingly extreme. And in a world of globalised communication, where everyone can see how the global elite live, such economic difference really matters. In Australia, although we may feel like things have become tighter since the halcyon days of the mining boom and the Howard government handouts, we're still amongst the wealthiest people in the world, and we consume vastly more of the Earth's resources than our grandparents ever did. And yet, in the midst of this staggering affluence, we are beset by an epidemic of mental ill health. According to the latest Hilda survey, 1 in 5 young women have been diagnosed with depression or anxiety, and 1 in 10 Australian adults takes an antidepressant each day. These threefold mega challenges, and there are more I could have included, are not separate phenomena, but rather together they amount to a single crisis, a crisis of the way that we live. And the way that we live is in very large part the product of an economic system, that same system that R.H. Tawney so strenuously opposed a century ago. All of this I say by way of preface and background. Tonight my subject is not capitalism as such, but rather the particular manifestation by which the global capitalist economy is most present and active to we here tonight. I'm talking, of course, about consumer culture, that all-pervasive, endlessly subtle phenomenon that influences us more than we know. I'll say a little more about what I mean by consumer culture in a moment, but let me first briefly lay out the ground I want to cover tonight. The central question I want to address is simply this: what does the context of consumer culture, as it presents itself to us in 21st century Australia, demand of Christian witness? To put it another way, what does it mean to be bearers of the good news of Jesus Christ in this time, in this place? What does good news look like now? Well, that's a huge question. Tonight I want to suggest 3 things. Firstly, in thinking about matters of economic justice, I want to suggest that the primary sphere of witness needs to move from the political to the everyday. Secondly, that we need to rebuild a corpus of Christian teaching on the ethics of everyday economic life. And thirdly, we need to move beyond thinking about economic conduct as merely a concern of ethics and begin to see it as a concern of salvation. So I think that should be enough to keep us going for the next 30 minutes. So what do I mean by consumer culture? Well, we might say it's the love child of capitalism and post-Enlightenment liberalism. In a consumer economy, rather than production being tailored to meet the needs of consumption, consumption has been tailored to meet the needs of production. And in this consumer economy, the core ethos is that of the free choosing, sovereign individual who determines their own wants and needs in the world. In this culture, identity is something that can be chosen and constructed. And in large part, this will be assisted by the consumption of things that signal identity. And indeed, this can require a very large material throughput of things, whether they be devices, fashion choices, food choices, recreational equipment, holidays, houses, cars, or whatever. However, despite this frenetic consumption of things, it would be a mistake to conclude that ultimate meaning is invested in these material goods. The hyperdisposability of all of these things exposes the lie to that myth. Actually, the primary thing being sought and consumed, for which the material goods are merely mediators, is in fact experiential gratification. Consumer culture should properly be understood as a spiritual phenomenon. It is something like what Paul describes in Ephesians as the power of the air, which means it resides in that category of things which the New Testament calls the principalities and powers. There have been many psychologists, social commentators, and theologians who have described consumerism as an addiction. Not just like an addiction, but an actual addiction. As Chad Myers puts it, we've become so internally and externally reliant upon our illusions of excess and appetites that we simply cannot imagine the world differently. We simply cannot imagine the world differently. Tawney understood that although we are not determined by the economic systems we live in, they do play a very significant role in shaping our moral character. And it was this insight that lay at the core of his objection to capitalism, of the way it misshapes human beings. Or as Daniel Bell has put it, the consumer economy is like a school of desire. It exerts enormous pressure to nurture and foster desire in certain directions. Under capitalist consumerism, our desire can be let loose in a seemingly infinite number of directions, but it is ultimately and inexorably desire that is oriented towards the self, towards gratification, and towards more. It's in this fog of consumer addiction that we have wrought the threefold crisis that I've described earlier: uncreating the world, our communities, and ourselves, but unable to imagine another way of doing things. What then is the Christian task in this moment and in this place? Seeing the destructiveness of the economic system in his day, R.H. Tawney saw it as his Christian duty to do what he could to change that economic system. And Christians like Tawney and his close friend William Temple had a remarkable influence in shaping the national political conversation in interwar Britain, and were in many ways the moral and intellectual architects of the post-war British welfare state. With such inspiring examples as Tawney and Temple, it's not surprising that through the 20th century, the church has generally assumed that its witness with regard to issues of economic justice is primarily discharged through its public voice. which means that economic witness has tended to take the form of public proclamations by the institutional church, by parachurch organisations, or sometimes by prominent Christian public intellectuals. It has therefore tended largely to be the concern of elite Christians, whether they be ordained or lay, and it has tended to happen irrespective of the views and economic lives of the broad membership of the church, and sometimes in spite of them. Theologically speaking, then, it has largely been a disembodied voice. The general assumption has, I think, been that the daily economic lives as Christians are not really at issue. But that will not do any more. For a whole host of reasons, the witness of Tawney and Temple, as much as I admire it, is not replicable in Australia today. The public influence and credibility of Australia the public influence and credibility of the church in Australia has perhaps never been what it was in Britain, especially not during the interwar period. But more pointedly, right now, we live in what we might call the post-Pell and the post-plebiscite era, when the moral credibility of the church in the minds of the Australian public is at an all-time low, and the hostility towards Christianity in a large segment of the intellectual elite is palpable. I do not blame them for this. It has largely been a known goal. Moreover, as sociologist James Hunter has pointed out, we live in an age when words increasingly fail to communicate meaning across divides of suspicion and misunderstanding. Words, and especially moral and religious words, have become divisive. Our great need in the present moment is to face up to Christianity's return to a place of marginality in the West, and I think in Australia more than most places. That means we will need to abandon the Constantinian habits of expecting the church can discharge its witness through its public voice, and return to the centrality of the day-to-day witness of the membership of the body of Christ. If we are to be bearers of a message of good news that speaks of a vision of economic justice and ecological harmony in this time and this place, then we must be able to communicate with something more than words. And perhaps the most meaningful way to do that is through the everyday economic practices of everyday Christians. Let me just at this point say, I'm not going to develop this point, I'm not here suggesting that Christians should abandon politics or thinking politically, but that we need to rethink where the primary location of our witness is. And I think also we probably need to think and look for a new way of thinking and acting politically, but that's not a subject I'm going to get into tonight. That would be way too much. If you want to talk about that later, maybe we could. Consumerism is a spiritual movement with a material culture delivered by an economic system. It's a culture of death lived out in everyday economic life. If this is true, then the central challenge of Christian witness is to embody a culture of life in everyday life. A culture that cares for and nurtures the natural world, human community, and the flourishing of the person in relationship. The first step in this, perhaps, is recognising the fundamental embeddedness and interconnection of our daily economic lives in the broader human systems, within the biosphere, and within the great household of the created order that God is reconciling back to himself. And here I'm going to be a little bit lazy and read you an excerpt from my book. Save me some work. The Greek word for house, oikos, is a root word from which we get economics, oikonomia, ecology, oikologia, and ecumenical, oikumene. Economics describes the management and ordering of the work, consumption, and finances of a household. Although economics as a discipline has now been abstracted to describe how we manage our affairs at the global and national levels, individual households still form the base unit of analysis. Ecology describes our attempts to understand the great household of nature, and in particular, to understand the interdependent relationships that support the functioning of that household. We've tended to think of economics and ecology as two separate spheres, when in fact the human economy exists entirely within the great household of nature and still depends entirely upon it, even if modern urban life gives us the illusion that we are somehow independent of nature. Ecumenism describes the movement towards unity within the household of God, usually referred to as the church. It's based on the recognition that belonging to Christ draws us so deeply into relationship with others that we are members of a single body. Generally, this last household, the church, is seen as having little to do with the other two. Moreover, in practice, the church even tends to have little to do with the ways in which its members run their homes. However, if we accept, as the Apostle Paul tells us, that faith in Christ requires presenting our bodies as living sacrifices, that is, conforming our day-to-day bodily and material existence to the way of Jesus, then we must understand our individual households as not merely the base of our participation in economy and ecology, but also the core site in which we enact or deny our membership in the household of faith in the hundreds of choices we make every day. And this is a diagram that appears in the book, showing the location of our homes in a series of households. So my purpose in writing the book has been to try to, and that's the end of the excerpt, by the way. My purpose in writing the book has been to try to and articulate a mode of everyday economic life that exhibits more care for all these households that we live in. The movements that I've argued are required of us can be roughly summarised under 5 broad headings. Firstly, the movement to what we'll call tonight, voluntary simplicity, although I've never found what I feel to be an adequate term for that. Involves 2 dimensions, really. The lowering of our material throughput, consuming less stuff, basically, and also being able to live on lower incomes. The second movement is a movement towards rethinking the ethics of employment and vocation as service. Thirdly, a movement to the practices of ethical consumption. Fourthly, a movement towards the practices of ethical investment. And fifthly, a renewed practice of household economy, which is in effect a practice of household ecology. Now, all of these things require a lot of filling out. I'm not going to do that tonight because, well, that would take a long time and I want you to read the book. The principles are easy to articulate, but the reality of none of them is straightforward. The devil is in the detail. So one of the key purposes in coming home, the purpose in coming home is not to try and articulate the right way to live, whatever that is, but to make an attempt at describing a movement in a different direction, couched in the concrete details of the real options available to us today. If our consumer addiction is manifest in our inability to imagine an alternative, then what the book attempts to describe is a movement towards reclaiming imagination. So whether I've succeeded in that or not, it's not for me to say. But I'm convinced that if the church in Australia is to be faithful to its gospel, then it needs to become a site where it is trying to reimagine life in the concrete and nitty-gritty detail of the options that actually present themselves to us. In effect, what I'm suggesting is that we need to rebuild a corpus of Christian teaching about everyday economic ethics that the medieval church referred to as casuistry. Now, casuistry is not a a word that I've used in the book. And beyond tonight, it's probably not a word you need to bother to remember. But it nevertheless is descriptive of something that in practice we all need to become more adept at doing. So let me say a few more words on casuistry. Casuistry was the ongoing and sustained effort of the medieval scholastics to apply what they called moral law to particular cases. And this was pursued with some vigour in relation to economic life for a period of 300 to 400 years. The two great pillars of this effort were the prohibition of usury, or the prohibition against interest, and the theory of just price, which both sound simple enough, but were ideas that continually morphed and could become very complex in the detail of how they were applied as the circumstances changed and as understandings of commercial life became more sophisticated. Over a 300 to 400 year period, the casuistry grew into a huge edifice of social teaching that was constantly being reworked. And Tawney, in his Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, expresses a certain amount of admiration for the whole project. However, the unfortunate reality is that such complex and nuanced intellectual work took place within a church structure that was riddled with corruption and prone to the distortions of wealth and power. And medieval casuistry was inevitably employed sometimes to justify the unjustifiable. To put it another way, medieval casuistry could never quite escape the taint of its Constantinian inheritance. Luther famously railed against the corruption of casuistry, and the word has since come down to us as a synonym for tricky evasions of simple moral truths. The practice of casuistry did not live long past the Reformation. Tawney regretted this abandonment. While Luther's critique of its corruption was in part justified, Tawney understood that some form of casuistry is always going to be necessary if the word is to become flesh in the messiness and complexity of human life. As he put it, the remedy for bad law is good law, not lawlessness. So when Luther inveighed against usury, or Bishop Laud in England denouncing closure of the commons, their words had the ring of hollow moralisms because they were not able to relate in practical terms to the new and changing economic conditions that were unfolding before them. Tawney wrote, "Their practical ineffectiveness prepared the way for their theoretical abandonment. They were abandoned because, on the whole, they deserved to be abandoned. The social teaching of the church had ceased to count because the church itself had ceased to think." Tawney wanted to see the church of his day rebuild a body of teaching on economic ethics that could once again usefully instruct the conduct of its members in everyday life. And to some extent, this work was begun in the ecumenical movement of the 1920s, but it was overwhelmed in the 1930s by the more pressing issues of responding to the Depression and growing international tensions. I would like to suggest that the time is now more than ripe to once again take up this challenge. Now, perhaps some here might be getting uncomfortable at this point, talking of resurrecting medieval casuistry and replacing bad law with good law. Is this not getting perilously close to resurrecting Pharisaical legalism and salvation by works? Is there not a danger of marking out a new righteous elect, those who are living justly and sustainably, marked out from those who are not? This is indeed, I think, a real danger, actually, and it's always a danger whenever we start to think rigorously about ethics. And it should prompt us to think a bit harder about what we're doing when we do this thing called ethics. Oliver O'Donovan, the English evangelical theologian, has done some useful work on this, I think. And here I'm referring to his 1994 book, Resurrection and Moral Order. O'Donovan's ambitious project is to describe a framework for what he calls evangelical ethics, by which he means ethics that is founded upon and entirely shaped by the gospel of Jesus Christ. For O'Donovan, all Christian ethics takes place in the light of the resurrection. The fact of the incarnation and then the bodily raising of Jesus from the dead signals God's profound yes to the life of the body and the created world. If the doom of the first Adam was to be trapped in a cycle of continually uncreating himself and the world around him, the dignity and the destiny of the second Adam, as Paul called Jesus, is to vindicate, restore, and fulfill all of creation. Thus, for O'Donovan, what we call ethics is simply participation in the created order as it is comprehended in the bright new redemptive light of Christ. What I think has been insufficiently recognised about O'Donovan's description of moral order, and why I think it's so useful to us now, is how ecological it is. And that's my term, not his. I mean that in two senses. Firstly, and fairly straightforwardly, O'Donovan's description of ethics is centrally concerned with humanity's relationship to and use of the natural world. But more deeply, I'm referring to the shape of what O'Donovan describes. Ecology describes the study of the natural world that pays particular attention not just to a single organism, which is zoology, but to the complex web of relationships between organisms, landscape, and climate. It is, in effect, the study of relatedness. The striking thing about O'Donovan's description of the moral order is the relatedness of everything. Because all creation is by definition the product of God's action and therefore of God's purpose, all creation is characterized by a purpose of flourishing and a purpose to serve. The flourishing of any individual part of creation, including and perhaps especially humanity, is inseparable from its purpose to contribute to the flourishing of the whole. The entry of sin into creation, and especially that of sinful humanity, describes a breakdown of the relationship between things, the breakdown of the flourishing to serve. Thus, for O'Donovan, what the New Testament calls the law of Christ, or the law of the Spirit of life, is in fact simply alignment to reality, the alignment that happens when we are in Christ. It is alignment to the way the cosmos really works, which is summed up in that big little word, love. So what we call moral law then, and I acknowledge this is not a term we're generally comfortable with these days, is really actually just a proper comprehension of the created order that has been formulated into broad principles that can guide action. Moral law describes how to live within the relatedness of all things that is the reality of God's creation. But the created order is astoundingly complex and diverse, and it is continually in the process of change. Therefore, while moral law is continually trying to apprehend the coherence of the whole thing, it's also being continually confronted with new and novel situations. So casuistry then, returning back to that, is the ongoing attempt to apply in very provisional ways the moral law to these particular and changing situations. For O'Donovan, the great flaw in the medieval practice of casuistry was its rigidness and its formalism. Once moral principles had been grasped by theological reflection, they were applied to life ethics in a fairly straightforward one-way direction. O'Donovan argues it actually needs to be a two-way process. The unfolding of new and difficult situations should, in effect, cause us to reflect anew upon our own understanding of the moral order And these new and difficult situations can and often leads us to a new and deeper understanding of the moral and created order. What I like about O'Donovan's description of moral order, which is directly related to the created order, is that it beautifully describes the challenges we're now thinking about in relation to our economic lives. What we see when we care to look, and we're now being forced to look, is that our economic actions do not stand alone in their own discrete sphere of ethics we can conveniently call economics. Our economic actions redound with impacts upon the ecology of the biosphere, upon the structure of the human community, and upon the nature of our relationships with those dearest to us, including God. So what I've attempted in coming home is essentially casuistry. I've tried to apply what the Bible reveals about moral order to our unfolding understanding of the created order to our contemporary consumer culture, to questions of our overall standard of living, how we earn our income, what we do with our leisure time, how we shop, how we invest our money, how we use and dispose of material goods, and many other things that Simon doesn't like. The attempt in all of these things, in all of these cases, is to try to pay attention to and to take care for the relatedness of our actions to everything else. Which brings me to my final and concluding point for the evening. When we say we're seeking to act ethically or justly or sustainably, what we often tend to mean is that we're trying to do the right thing. The problem is that trying to do the right thing can very easily and very quickly become a very burdensome load. And we have to wonder whether sometimes trying to do the right thing subtly morphs into trying to please God. For this reason, I think one of our great needs in the present moment is to move beyond seeing questions of economic questions as just questions of ethics and beginning to see them as questions of salvation. What? Am I saying you need to do these things to be saved? No, not quite. Not at all. If we continue to allow our lives to be shaped by that addictive fog I've called consumer culture, then we are continuing to live our lives as if they are not intimately connected to the rest of God's created order. We are in fact living in unreality. But if we are seeking, by whatever tools we have available to us, to live into our connections to each other and to the earth, and if we're seeking to take care for and to nurture those relationships, then we are beginning to live into that great economy of love that is God's will for all creation. And that, I think, is a pretty good definition of salvation. We are saved from the captivity of the self alone in the cosmos, and we are saved into the communion of love between God and all things on heaven and earth. And this is a movement that is only really possible in Christ and through the Holy Spirit. Salvation begins now, not after we die, which is why Paul talks about it in 3 tenses. We have been saved, we are being saved, and we will be saved. To put it straightforwardly, the reason why those of us who follow Christ need to begin to make a break with consumer culture and to try to make choices in favour of the economically dispossessed and in favour of the earth is because it is profoundly good for us. And the more that we can live into this truth and see it, the more we will be people who can point to the tangibility of good news in our lives. We will have an evangel that will be able to communicate to people in a time when religious words communicate so little. Thank you.